about the state of the world they were handing over to future generations. Given many of the news stories and events happening, it's hard not to think that. A voice came over the intercom. For the passengers of Flight 3935, a summertime flight out of Washington, D.C., please collect their carry-on luggage and exit the plane. The passengers gathered on the tarmac alongside the plane and witnessed something I hope that I never have to see. It was so hot that the plane had sunk into the black pavement as if it were wet cement. After attempts by a series of increasingly powerful tow vehicles, the plane was finally dislodged and went along its merry way. I'm not sure what disturbs me more about this story, that it got so hot that it actually happened, or that the passengers and airline company hardly gave it a second thought before they hopped back on the plane and generated even more emissions, contributing to our accelerating climate change. Now, don't worry that this is going to be too much of a downer today. We're going to get to the hope eventually. But as we sang at the beginning of our service, sometimes that hope is just hard to find. I grew up as an environmentalist. Not just a we need to care for the earth kind of environmentalist, but I had 50 things you can do for the earth memorized. And I went around my family making and suggesting every possible change that I could think of. It wasn't something my parents were into or any of my siblings. It was just me. And it kept going beyond my childhood too. I helped start up an environmental effort at my first UU church. This was before Green Sanctuary existed. Started up a Green Sanctuary committee and another, helped to found the Baltimore Green Forum, and I ran their communications and marketing for a year. And I've integrated simplicity and environmentalism throughout my own life and household. But it turned out that it wasn't sustainable for me. My voracious reading caught up with me one day. I had heard a book mentioned, and then stumbled onto, through that book and another, and the problematic readers who liked this also liked Bliss. A couple of books later, I found one that utterly crushed my sense of hope. The reality and modeling described by this book, and no, don't ask, I'm not going to tell you what it is. What this book said dismantled every dream I've been carrying. And I still haven't found a way to get my hope back. When despair for the world grows in me. News and models about climate change aren't the only things that can disrupt our sense of hope and leave us with despair instead. The murders of Michael Brown, Eric Garner, and many others, and the aftermaths. The fact that we're only a month into 2015 and Wilmington has already seen 6 homicides. The fears and dangers that get infused throughout our regular news. And on personal levels, unemployment, financial difficulties, injuries, illnesses, and chronic pain that leave the future ever more uncertain. Sometimes it is hard to find hope. And then there are also forces that work to drain away the hope we've got. I don't have to stretch very far to claim that fear and despair are amplified by our culture and especially our mass media. In Rittenberg's story, I think this is where his parents were acting from, the fear that was kicked up by our news media stories. Now, I'm not saying that our news is saying things that are untrue, although it always helps to read with a critical eye. But I get upset nearly every time I go through the entire news myself. Stories of peace and success do get airtime, but it seems like not nearly as much as destruction does. And there are a couple of things about human nature that are working against us too. The human brain estimates probabilities based on how easily it can come up with an example of something happening. And randomness and magnitude can fool our brains too, into assuming something is more widespread than it really is. Combine that with the abundance of examples of destruction, and I can see why I wake up at night worried for my daughter's future, too. These are things that drain our hope and feed our despair. But I think that there are ways that we can counter them. We don't have to let these things drain our hope and well-being. First, we can intentionally limit our exposure, not getting drawn in by these seductive, fearful headlines. My husband has been doing a bit of this lately himself. For short breaks, he used to peruse CNN's homepage, sometimes more news, sometimes alternating between news and sports. And sorry, football fans, it's college basketball he's into. Lately, though, under the guise of looking for things to open lectures with, he's changed to spending those breaks with humorous YouTube videos. Others have shared with me how they seek out human interest stories and particular columnists that frequently inspire them. It's crucial to remain aware of what's going on in our world, to be engaged in a meaningful manner. I believe that is one of the responsibilities of our faith. But it doesn't mean we have to drown in the agony of it. We have a choice. We can limit our exposure to the fear. We can remember the big picture progress that's been made and not get paralyzed by each individual tragedy. Maybe they can fuel us instead. We have a choice. But coming back to my own search for hope, these things, as well as whatever else each one of us needs, these are what we can do to address the drain on our sense of hope. But we still need to find what will replenish it for us. My underground environmentalist self isn't through yet. I still want to find reason to hope. I want to find ways to hope. When despair for the world grows in me, I go down and rest where the wood drake rests and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time I rest in the peace of the world and am free. Poet Wendell Berry finds his reason to hope in his experience of wild things and the promise that the light of the stars is there even when he can't see it. Activist Joanna Macy draws on the natural world for the work that she leads, but from some different perspectives. She calls it despair work. And what she does is she works with groups, not folks alone, but she works with groups and leads them to open themselves to the pain. She leads them to lean into their despair in a very intentional way. Her belief is that by leaning into the pain and despair, that then we find hope. I admit I'm intrigued by this idea. Ever since I lost my environmental hope for despair, I feel like I've run away from that. And every time it sneaks up on me again, my first reaction is I don't want to think about it. That it feels frightening to even think about going down that rabbit hole. So I stop myself. But this ultimately hasn't gotten me to anywhere different. Maybe for starters, if I were going to lean into it, I should finish the book that got me going on it. I haven't touched it since then. Joanna Macy has this fantastic definition for hope that really recenters my understanding. She says, hope is an openness to the future. Hope is an openness that arises out of our evolutionary history and our living systems. Hope isn't for any particular thing or an attachment to an outcome we desire. It's an openness toward what you don't even have the capacity to think about because you're still in the present. Hope is a radical openness to what can be. don't even know yet. I think one thing that gets in the way of our hope is when we think we know what the future will be, but we really don't. That's when we need openness and imagination. This is the first part of a two-step plan I want to propose to help us find our hope again. 2 steps. First, magical thinking, and second, starting anyway. Magical thinking. Leading into the future we don't know, leading through our pain and despair. This openness, this hope, this is magical. Just for me to try to believe what will be there is a magical act. Now, I'm not talking about magic Harry Potter style, although that is fun to think about too. And to be quite clear, there are no magical solutions to any of our problems. This is a fallacy that sometimes we can get wrapped up in, thinking that some idea will solve a whole cluster of problems. This kind of thinking can get going in just about any context, including right here in our church. There are no seemingly simple, magical solutions. And if there were, they would have been found a long time ago and already fixed our complex problems. Instead, for me, magical thinking is about lifting ourselves out of the rational world that I'm a bit comfortable in. Lifting beyond the rational world and looking beyond that to what we can't see. Joanna Macy reminds us of this, that hope is an openness to the future that we don't even have the capacity to see because we're grounded here in the present. There's a little of this future that I can see in our children. This is one of my sources for hope. This source for hope I call the philosophy of, well, duh. As I see my daughter and other children encountering many of the realities in our world, I see how much things just baffle them. When she saw news about the violence in Ferguson, news about how black youth were treated even closer to home, she just couldn't comprehend it. It was so far from her value system that she couldn't understand it. But that is exactly what makes me hope. And it's not just her, it's kids from all sorts of backgrounds, from liberal families, conservative families, and everything in between. Well, duh, of course anybody could get married. What's the big idea? Why are people losing their minds? Their skin just looks different. Everyone should have homes. And apparently computers and Minecraft too. But why doesn't the country just change to make this happen? Duh. Magic? I'm not sure, but I tell you what, I am totally open to this future that these kids are going to create. Step 1, magical thinking. Step 2, starting anyway. Starting anyway. I think this takes either idealism or stubbornness. In a story by Rittenberg, he found his sense of hope from looking at pictures of his ancestors and believing the future would be better. Now, not saying anything to disrupt his sense of hope, sometimes that's what it takes. But I get the sense that this hope can be shaken pretty easily, and it maybe is really more the immature idealism of a 16-year-old, which, granted, he was. And you know, I've been there. Sometimes I wonder how much I'm still there, and I watch with some relief as the different parts of myself mature a bit. But as this kind of idealism will help to start anyway rather than just worrying about the future. Starting anyway helps us encounter what we need for a more fully developed sense of hope. But what happens when there isn't idealism to be found? That's when it helps to be stubborn. I found I'm in pretty good company when it comes to that regard here, eh? So stubbornness, this is the I'm going to do it anyway no matter what it takes philosophy. I believe it may be a little more prevalent than average amongst Unitarian Universalists. Channeling this will help us keep moving forward. Channeling this helps us keep going on with the work. And not just doing the work alone, but with others. Despair doesn't have to be a lonely thing. Someone was was sharing with me recently about a time when she had lost her sense of hope. And she was having to be with a group of people for some work they were doing. And it was that group of people that shifted things for her. They restored her sense of hope. They restored it. She described it as being with other people who were doing the work. Hope isn't just some extra thing that it's nice to have. Hope is an anchor. I've thought for a long time that hope was the opposite of despair, but I've realized that that's not quite true. Hope and despair, they exist side by side. The despair, it's there. It rises and it falls in waves. But hope sits right there alongside it. Hope is what enables us to keep going, enables us to keep dreaming, keep working despite the despair. Hope is empowering. Hope gets us through. May it be so.